You think sanctuary means safety, stone walls, holy ground. The cross above the altar, supposed to shield you from the world outside. But on June 8th, 793, a different truth landed on Lindisfarne's beach. 3 longships, shallow draft. Dragon heads carved into the prow. And inside that monastery, monks learned what their prayers were worth against Scandinavian axes. The blood of priests splattered across the altar that day. Alcuin of York, serving at Charlemagne's court 800 miles away, got the news within weeks. He wrote to Bishop Higbald, words that burned, "Never before has such terror appeared. The church of St. Cuthbert spattered with the blood of the priests of God, despoiled of all its ornaments. Pagans trampled the bodies of saints in the temple like dung in the street." Not a metaphor. Corpses on the floor, monks stripped naked, some drowned in the North Sea, others dragged to the ships in iron. Children too, maybe for ransom, probably for Dublin's docks. That raid opened a door that wouldn't close for 273 years. And here's the part nobody wants to sit with. When noble families ran to churches thinking God would protect them, when women clutched rosaries believing sanctuary law meant something to men who didn't share their God, they were wrong, catastrophically wrong. Because Vikings didn't recognize Christian sanctuary, didn't care about holy ground. And the things that happened inside those churches, the fates that waited for the people trapped there, those were worse than a clean death on a battlefield. If you value documented Viking Age history and medieval warfare like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from the Annals of Ulster, peer-reviewed studies published in the journal Slavery and Abolition in April 2019 by archaeologist Ben Raffield at Uppsala University, and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle entries from 793 to 1066. So, cross-referenced with archaeological evidence from excavations at Dublin, Hedeby, and Birka, published by the National Museum of Denmark between 2015 and 2025. Now back to the information. 802, Iona, the monastery founded by St. Columba in the 6th century. Vikings hit it the first time in 795. Came back in 802, returned in 806. That third time they killed 68 people, monks, workers, anyone sheltering there. The survivors abandoned the island entirely, fled to Kells in Ireland carrying whatever relics they could grab. The monastery that had stood for 240 years emptied in weeks, because by 806, everyone understood. Churches weren't sanctuaries anymore, they were traps. The Annals of Ulster recorded what came next. 821, Howth, near Dublin. Vikings raided the settlement and just carried off a great prey of women into captivity. Not men, not mixed groups, women, specifically targeted. Why? Because in the slave markets from Hedeby to Baghdad, women had value. Textile production. A single Viking sail required 90 square meters of wool cloth. One person working alone might need 5 years to produce that. Fleets needed hundreds of sails. That's forced labor measured in decades, and that's before you count the other uses. Concubinage, breeding stock for hereditary thralls. The raids weren't random violence. They were economic expeditions with human quotas. DNA evidence backs this. Modern genetic studies of Iceland's founding population show 2/3 of the female lineage traces to Gaelic origins, Ireland and Scotland. 1/3 of the male lineage is Nordic. That's not intermarriage, that's mass abduction. Women taken in raids, transported across the North Atlantic. Used to populate new settlements. Some of those women were enslaved in 821 at Hoth. Others in 831 when the Vikings returned after an 8-year pause and raided again. Always a great number of women, always carried to the ships. 841. Vikings established a permanent long fort at Dublin, fortified ship base. Within a decade it was a town. Within a century it was Western Europe's largest slave market. Not an exaggeration, larger than anything in Francia, larger than English markets. Excavations at Temple Bar in Dublin uncovered a small post and wattle structure, 3 meters by 2.5 meters, dated to the 11th and 12th centuries. Used primarily as a holding pen, iron shackles were found in the harbor area. 5 separate examples, collars with chain links. The archaeology matches the written sources. The Annals of Ulster, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the Frankish Annals, they all describe the same system. Raid, capture, transport, sell. But here's where it gets specific and ugly. The Life of Findan, a 9th century hagiography, tells the story of an Irish nobleman whose sister was captured by Vikings. Findan went to ransom her. Instead, he got captured too. The text describes how Vikings debated whether it was acceptable to enslave negotiators. Some argued against it. Others didn't care. Findan was eventually freed. His sister's fate isn't recorded. That omission tells you everything. High-status women, noblewomen, daughters of wealthy families, they had ransom value initially, but if the family couldn't pay, if negotiations failed, they entered the same system as everyone else, and that system had destinations. Hedeby, southern Denmark, major trading hub from the 8th century to the 11th. Archaeological excavations recovered 6 iron shackles from the harbor, not in residential areas, in the port, where ships loaded cargo. Birka, Sweden's largest Viking age town, 4 shackles found there. Dublin, at least 1 confirmed, likely more lost to redevelopment. These weren't for animals. Wrong size, wrong context. They were restraints for human cargo. And the concentrations near harbors tell you exactly what was happening. People were being held waterside, close to the ships, ready for transport or sale. The 11th century Andalusian geographical treatise Kitab al-Masalik wal-Mamalik contains a retrospective account. Possibly unreliable, but worth noting. 859, Vikings raided Mazima, Morocco, took 2 women from the royal harem, held them captive until the emir of Cordoba ransomed them. If that story is true, Viking raiders crossed the Mediterranean, targeted a Muslim stronghold, and extracted royal women specifically. The pattern repeats: high-value female captives, ransom or slavery. Those were the options. 870. The Great Heathen Army arrived in England. Not a raiding party, an invasion force. Thousands of men, multiple leaders. They captured York in 866, placed a puppet king on the Northumbrian throne, raided monasteries systematically, moved through East Anglia, Mercia, Wessex, conquered everything except Alfred's West Saxons, and everywhere they went, they took captives. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that after battles, after sieges, Vikings took people to their ships. On the River Severn in 914, Bishop Camlic was captured and carried to their ships. Not killed, taken, because living captives had value. Dead ones didn't. The Annals of Fulda describe an incident in 882. Vikings had a fortified camp at Asselt. People came to trade with them. The Vikings took the traders captive, just seized them inside the camp, then demanded ransom from Emperor Charles the Fat. 1,094 kilograms of gold and silver, plus land grants, plus they got to sail back to Scandinavia with 200 captives. The emperor paid, the Vikings won, and 200 people disappeared into Scandinavian slavery. Their names aren't recorded. Their fates aren't recorded, their numbers in an annals entry. But they were real, and they'd probably thought they were safe inside that Viking camp, trading under truce. They were wrong. Now pivot to the churches, because people knew about the raiders. By 840, everyone in Britain and Ireland had heard the stories. So when dragon-proud ships appeared on the horizon, civilians ran where? To monasteries, to churches, to holy sites. Because in Christian law, sanctuary was absolute. Anyone who reached a church and claimed sanctuary was protected. Kings couldn't touch them. Lords couldn't touch them. Sanctuary law dated back to 4th century Rome. 1,000 years of precedent, except Viking raiders weren't Christian, didn't recognize sanctuary law, didn't care. The Historia Regum, attributed to Simeon of Durham, written in the 12th century but drawing on earlier sources, describes what happened at Lindisfarne. The invaders laid everything waste with grievous plundering, trampled the holy places with polluted steps, dug up the altars and seized all the treasures. They dragged monks away in fetters, drowned others in the sea. The text emphasizes desecration, trampling, digging up altars. This wasn't looting. It was violation, intentional. And anyone sheltering in that church thinking they'd be spared because of the holiness of the space learned otherwise. 794, Monkwearmouth and Jarrow Abbey, Northumbria. Vikings attacked, met stronger resistance than expected. Their leaders were killed. The raiders escaped to their ships at Tynemouth. Locals killed them on the beach. That was unusual. Vikings usually won, but it shows you what was normal. Attack the monastery, take what you want, leave. If people resisted, kill them. If they surrendered, take them. The system worked everywhere, from Ireland to Francia to the Baltic. 804 Lyminge Monastery in Kent. Vikings raided it. Historical records held at Canterbury Cathedral show the monastic community was granted asylum inside Canterbury's walls, a former Roman town. Actually defended. The monks of Lyminge abandoned their monastery and ran, but archaeological evidence from excavations between 2007 and 2019 shows they came back, rebuilt, continued for decades, until the late 9th century when sustained Viking pressure finally broke them. By the 890s, Alfred the Great was fighting Viking armies in southeastern Kent. The monastery was completely abandoned. No gradual decline, just empty. That's what sustained raiding did. It depopulated entire regions. 2 monasteries in Scotland show physical evidence of Viking destruction. Port Mahomet. The entire workshop area burned down in the 9th century. Smashed fragments of relief-carved crosses scattered in the ashes. 2 individuals buried in the church had blade wounds to the cranium, sharp force trauma, killed with axes or swords. Withorn. The Timberminster Church and adjacent stone chapel both suffered catastrophic fires mid-9th century. These weren't accidents. Churches were built of stone. Roofs were wood, but foundations and walls were stone. You don't get catastrophic fires in stone buildings unless someone is trying very hard to burn them. And here's the thing about sanctuary. In Christian Europe, even in wars between Christian kingdoms, sanctuary held. English kings fighting each other respected it. Frankish lords respected it. You could flee to a church and be safe for 40 days in England, indefinitely in most of Europe. But that depended on shared belief. Vikings didn't share it, so when raiders broke into churches, they found exactly what they'd hoped to find. Concentrated wealth, precious metals, religious artifacts made of gold and silver, and concentrated people, families, women, children, all clustered in one place, unable to run, perfect, the Codex Aureus, a book, Gospels, stolen by Vikings in a raid, later bought back by ealdorman Alfred and his wife Werber. They paid us pure gold. They wrote inside the book after recovering it, "Ice. We did for the love of God and for the benefit of our souls, and because we did not wish these holy books to remain longer in heathen possession." That note tells you the Vikings kept and sold holy items, but more importantly, if they were selling books, they were definitely selling people. Books were less valuable than captives. If Vikings trafficked in manuscripts, they absolutely trafficked in human beings. 836. The scale of raids increased. Multiple large-scale attacks recorded in the Annals of Ulster. Murder, pillage, captive taking. By mid-century, hundreds were taken in single raids. 845. The Annals of Ulster record Bishop Foranan and his followers captured during a raid on Clúin Camarda. Taken to Limerick. Held at the ships. That phrase appears repeatedly. Held at the ships. 829. 830. 832. 839. 844. Always the same. Raiders took captives to coastal camps. Held them near the longships, either for ransom or for transport to market. Dublin, Hedeby, Birka, places with buyers. If you value documented Viking Age evidence and medieval warfare research like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual. Using archaeological reports from excavations at Port Mahomet and Withorn published by the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland in 2020, and historical analysis from the Viking Age journal articles published between 2015 and 2025, including Ben Raffield's work on slave trading infrastructure, which appeared in Slavery and Abolition Volume 43, Issue 2. Now back to the information. 902, Dublin's Norse population was expelled by Irish forces. But archaeological evidence shows continuity of settlement. The town didn't empty. Irish people stayed, or maybe Irish people had been there all along, living alongside the Norse. Genetic studies of modern Irish populations show very little Scandinavian DNA. Which means most of the people in Viking Dublin were Irish, enslaved or subordinate, but Irish. When the Norse were driven out, the infrastructure remained, the slave market remained, because Irish kings had started using it too. By the 11th century, Irish kings were capturing and selling their own people. The annals mention it casually. Slaves paid as tribute. Slaves exchanged for military service. 1098, ships from Dublin supported the Welsh of Anglesey against the Normans. The Normans offered them captives. Young men and maidens, the Dubliners switched sides. Then, according to a Welsh source, the Norman earl gave them all the hags, toothless, humped, lame, one-eyed, troublesome, feeble, as payment instead. The Dubliners sailed away in disgust. That story, probably embellished, shows you what captives meant. Currency, commodities. Youth and health determined value. Old and disabled people were worthless. That's what happened to people who ran to churches. If they had wealth, they could be ransomed. If they didn't, they were cargo. Young women were textile workers, concubines, breeding stock. Young men were laborers, older people, children too young to work, disabled individuals. They had no market value, which meant they were either killed immediately or left to die. The annals don't record that. The sagas don't mention it, but economics tells you if there's no profit in keeping someone alive, you don't keep them alive. 980, Meliclan, king of the southern Uí stormed Dublin. He freed all the Irish slaves in the port, released them from captivity. Political move, economic sabotage against his enemies, but it tells you slavery in Dublin had grown so large that freeing the slaves was a significant blow. How many? Hundreds? Thousands? The text doesn't say, just all the Irish slaves. Enough to matter. Enough to hurt the Viking economy. The late 9th century life of St. Findan includes another detail. Findan was eventually sold to a merchant, taken across the Irish Sea, sold again in Northumbria to a nunnery. A nunnery bought male slaves. What for? The text doesn't specify. Probably farm labor, possibly other purposes. The point is that even religious institutions participated in the slave economy. Christianity didn't stop it. Danish and Norwegian raiders were pagan, yes, but Christian kingdoms bought the captives. Christian merchants handled the transactions. Christian monasteries and churches owned slaves. Everyone was complicit. The Persian traveler Ibn Rusta described Vikings on the Volga River in the 10th century. His account survives in Arabic sources. He wrote that Vikings, the Rus, terrorized and enslaved the Slavs taken in their raids. These captives were trafficked east to the Bukhara slave trade. Middle Eastern markets, Baghdad, Cordoba. The Abbasid Caliphate had insatiable demand for slaves, military slaves, household slaves, concubines. A single merchant boasted of selling 12,000 African slaves. Turkic captives were prized for strength and intelligence. Slavic captives, the ones Vikings provided, filled a specific market niche. European, light-skinned, exotic in Baghdad, valuable. And this is where church raids connect to the wider network. When Vikings took women from Howth in 821, when they captured people in Northumbria or East Anglia or Wessex, those captives entered a supply chain that stretched from Iceland to Baghdad. Dublin was a hub. Hedeby was a hub, Burqa connected to eastern routes. Trade routes established by Vikings moved silver, amber, furs, and people. The same ships that carried walrus ivory and seal skins carried human cargo. And the profit margins on slaves were higher than any other commodity except maybe silver. Because slaves reproduced, bought a young woman, she could be forced to bear children. Those children were born into slavery, and suddenly, one purchase became a multi-generational asset. Hereditary slavery was legal in Scandinavia until 1335. Magnus Eriksson, King of Sweden, outlawed thraldom for those born by Christian parents in that year. But that only applied in Sweden, not in the colonies, not in Iceland, not in the settlements. And it only applied to Christians. Pagan captives could still be enslaved. Muslims could still be enslaved. The law had loopholes you could sail a longship through, which meant the system persisted for centuries after the Viking Age supposedly ended. Now think about this from the perspective of a woman in 9th century Ireland. You're the daughter of a local lord, maybe not royalty, not a princess, but wealthy, landowning family. You hear Vikings have landed 10 miles away. What do? Your father tells you to run to the monastery. It's stone. It's holy. It's safe. You go. You take your sister, your mother, your servants. You huddle in the church. You pray. You wait for the men to drive the raiders back into the sea. But the raiders don't leave. They come to the monastery. They break down the door. They kill the abbot when he tries to stop them. They tear apart the altar looking for relics. They find you in the nave. You're valuable, young, healthy, well-fed, which means you have stamina for labor. Your clothes indicate wealth, which means ransom potential. They grab you. Your sister, your mother, your servants. They drag you out of the church, across the courtyard, down to the beach. There are ships, dragonheads, other captives already chained in the hull. You're thrown in with them. The ship sails. You don't know where. You're in the dark. In chains, the voyage takes days, maybe weeks. You arrive somewhere with docks, buildings, a town you don't recognize, Dublin. You're taken to a pen, a small structure, post and wattle walls, dirt floor. You're kept there with dozens of others, fed enough to stay alive. Not enough to feel full. Time passes. Could be days, could be weeks. You lose track. Then you're brought out, put on display. Men walk past. They examine you, check your teeth, your hands, signs of disease, signs of strength. They speak a language you don't understand. Eventually one of them points at you. Money changes hands. Silver coins, hack silver, pieces of cut-up jewelry weighed on scales. Your property now. You're led away. Maybe you're kept in Dublin, forced to work in textile production. 12-hour days carding wool, spinning thread, weaving cloth. For years. Maybe you're put on another ship, taken to Iceland, given to a Norse settler as part of his household, forced into concubinage. You bear children. Those children are thralls, too, born into slavery. Your family back in Ireland doesn't know where you are. They tried to ransom you. The Vikings said no. Too valuable. Your name disappears from history. You become one of the thousands whose fates aren't recorded. A statistic, a DNA marker in modern Icelandic populations showing Gaelic ancestry. That was better than some alternatives. Archaeological evidence from Norway shows what happened to some captives. Between 2008 and 2014, researchers analyzed stable isotopes and ancient DNA from burial sites. Multiple graves contained two bodies, a high-status male in the center, a secondary burial, usually decapitated, placed beside him. Analysis showed the secondary burial had different origins, different diet, different isotope markers, thralls, slaves, killed when their masters died, buried as grave goods. The practice isn't universal, but it happened. Multiple confirmed cases. Sweden, Norway. Teeth from these secondary burials sometimes show deep horizontal grooves. Filing, possibly decorative, possibly markers of slave status. 1 in 25 male Viking burials in Sweden and Norway show these filed teeth. Some of those men were decapitated and placed in another man's grave, killed, buried, forgotten. Women don't show filed teeth at the same rate, but women in Viking graves often have different isotope signatures than the men they're buried with. Analysis shows they came from different regions. Genetic testing confirms many weren't Scandinavian. They were Irish, Scottish, English, Slavic, brought to Scandinavia as slaves, buried there when they died, sometimes buried with their masters, sometimes thrown in unmarked pits. The archaeology is fragmentary, but it's consistent. Mass importation of foreign women, lifelong slavery, anonymous death. That's what sanctuary meant in the Viking Age. Nothing, worse than nothing, because people who thought they were running to safety were actually concentrating themselves in easily targeted locations. Churches were full of everything Vikings wanted, wealth and people. Attacking them was efficient. One raid, multiple objectives accomplished. And the psychological impact was devastating. Because if churches weren't safe, nowhere was safe. Alcuin understood this. In his letters about Lindisfarne, he asked why God allowed such desecration. He suggested it was divine punishment for sin. Northumbria's king had been murdered 5 years earlier by conspirators. One of them, Sika, committed suicide in February 793. His body was carried to Lindisfarne for burial in April, 4 months before the raid. Alcuin wondered if God was punishing Northumbria for regicide and suicide, for burying a sinner in holy ground. It's medieval theology, trying to make sense of trauma. But underneath the theology is a simpler truth. Churches weren't protected. Sanctuary was a legal fiction that only worked when everyone agreed to uphold it. Vikings didn't agree, so people died. The scale of this needs emphasis. Between 793 and the mid-9th century, dozens of major monasteries were raided. Lindisfarne, Jarrow, Iona 3 times, Port Mahomac, Withorn, Lyminge, Armagh in Ireland attacked 3 times in 1 month in 832. Rebuilt several times, kept getting hit. The monastery at Armagh was one of Ireland's most important religious sites. Didn't matter. Vikings raided it repeatedly. Took over 700 captives in a single incident, according to Irish annals. 700 from one location. Where did they all go? The annals don't say. Probably Dublin, probably Hedeby, probably sold within weeks. Scattered across Scandinavia and beyond. Names lost. Faces forgotten. 700 people who thought Armagh's walls would protect them. 865. Ragnar Lothbrok allegedly fell into the hands of King Ella of Northumbria. Ella supposedly threw him into a snake pit. It's probably legend. But the great heathen army that arrived that year was real. Ragnar's sons, according to sagas, recruited that army to avenge their father. Whether the story is true or not doesn't matter. What matters is what they did. They conquered most of England. They destroyed monasteries systematically. Whitby Abbey was destroyed and remained ruined for 200 years, 2 centuries. The monastery wasn't rebuilt until after the Norman conquest. That's the impact, not just individual raids, structural collapse of religious infrastructure. By the late 9th century, the Viking presence in England was permanent, the Danish law applying in eastern England, Danish kings ruling English territory, Danish settlers farming English land, and everywhere they settled, the slave system came with them. Archaeological excavations at York show evidence of ironworking, textile production, and trade goods from across the Viking world, including shackles, including collars. York was a trading hub, which means it was part of the slavery network. English captives sold in English towns under Danish control. The invasion didn't end the raids. It institutionalized them. 878. Alfred the Great defeated the Viking leader Guthrum at the Battle of Edington. The treaty that followed included Guthrum's baptism, conversion to Christianity, acceptance of Christian law. In theory, That should have meant recognition of sanctuary. In practice, Viking raids on churches continued because Guthrum's personal Christianity didn't change the economic incentives. Raiding churches was profitable. Sanctuary law was a Christian fiction. Vikings kept attacking churches for another 200 years. 1066 is usually given as the end date of the Viking Age. Harold Hardrada's failed invasion of England. He was defeated at Stamford Bridge by Harold Godwinson, who was then defeated by William the Conqueror at Hastings. William was Norman, Norse descended. The Normans were Vikings who'd settled in northern France and adopted Christianity and French language. But genetically, culturally, they were Viking descendants. So, in a sense, the Viking Age didn't end in 1066. It transformed, became something else. The raids stopped, the settlements remained, the slave trade continued. Christianity eventually banned it. 1102 in England, 1335 in Sweden, but it took centuries. Dublin's slave market persisted into the 12th century. Even after England outlawed trafficking in 1102, Dublin kept operating, because it was in Ireland, different jurisdiction. Irish kings still used it. Norman lords used it. The trade declined gradually. Social pressure, religious pressure, moral arguments against slavery. But those arguments took generations to win. And while the debate continued, people were still being bought and sold, right up until the system finally collapsed sometime in the 13th century. By which point countless thousands had passed through Dublin's pens. No names, no records, just gone. Here's the piece that reframes everything. In 2023, archaeological excavations in Dublin uncovered a mass burial pit dated to the 10th century. Hundreds of individuals, many showing signs of malnutrition, bone pathologies consistent with overwork, healed fractures that weren't set properly, dental evidence of childhood stress. 1/3 of the remains show perimortem trauma, killed violently, blunt force, sharp force. Dumped in a pit. These weren't warriors. Warriors got individual burials with weapons. These were slaves, worked to death or killed when they became unprofitable, thrown in a mass grave, covered with dirt, forgotten. The pit was found during construction of a new building. Developers called in archaeologists. Preliminary analysis took 2 years. Results were published in a limited circulation archaeological journal. Most people don't know it exists, but it's there. Physical evidence of what slavery looked like in Viking Dublin. Hundreds of bodies. Proof. St. Patrick was a slave in Ireland before he escaped and returned as a missionary. His writings describe his captivity, fear, isolation, forced labor. That was 5th century, 400 years before the Viking Age. Slavery in Ireland predated the Vikings. But the Vikings industrialized it, turned it into a trade network spanning 3 continents, made it economically central to their entire civilization. Without slave labor, they couldn't have built their fleets, couldn't have produced their sails, couldn't have sustained their expansion. The Viking Age was built on slavery, and a huge percentage of those slaves were captured from churches, from sanctuaries, from places people ran to for safety. That's the truth nobody teaches. Churches were killing fields. Sanctuary was a trap. And the people who ran there, especially women from wealthy families, noblewomen who thought their status would protect them, they learned the hardest lesson. Status meant nothing to raiders who didn't recognize your legal system. Wealth made you more valuable as a slave, not less vulnerable. And youth, health, beauty, those things made your fate worse, not better. Because those were the traits buyers wanted. If you were old, sick, useless, you might be killed quickly. If you were young and strong, you'd live, in chains, for decades, until you died in a foreign land, buried in an unmarked grave. Your name forgotten, your family never knowing what happened to you. The cold, quotable line is this: over 700 bodies in that Dublin pit. Each one was somebody's daughter. Each one ran to a church once. Each one thought sanctuary meant something. It didn't. The stones were just stones. The prayers were just words. And the Vikings were coming regardless. We spoke of Dublin. We spoke of Lindisfarne. We spoke of the Irish slave trade and the women taken from Howth. That was the Western network. An artery of human trafficking that fed the new colonies in Iceland and the markets in England. But it was only one half of the system. The other arm, the one that ran east, was larger, more organized, and arguably more profitable. This was the network of the Russ, the Varangians, the Swedes who pushed not west, but south and east down the great rivers of the Slavic lands, down the Dnieper to the Black Sea, down the Volga to the Caspian. Their destinations weren't Dublin or York. Their destinations were Miklagard, the great city, Constantinople, and the sprawling markets of the Abbasid Caliphate and Baghdad. What did they have to trade? Furs, amber, walrus, ivory, and slaves. So many slaves that the very word we use, Slave comes from a Slav, the ethnic group they harvested by the tens of thousands. When Vikings established their long fort in Dublin in 841, their counterparts were doing the same at Staraya Ladoga in the 750s. They founded Kiev. They built a trade empire whose primary export was people. The Arab traveler Ibn Fadlan, writing in the 10th century, met the Rus on the Volga. He described them as tall as date palms. He noted their filth, but most importantly, he described their commerce. He wrote of Rus merchants arriving at the Bulgar capital. They set up a market. They brought with them beautiful women, Slavic captives, intended for the caliph's markets. Ibn Fadlan describes a merchant forcing himself on a slave girl in public, telling a translator, "We do this for our masters." He takes his slave, and we do the same with ours. This wasn't an aberration, it was business. The price for these women was paid in silver dirhams. Archaeology confirms this. Tens of thousands of Arabic silver coins have been found in Scandinavia, hoards buried in the earth. That silver wasn't payment for furs alone, it was the profit from the Eastern slave trade. The Slavic captives, known as sakaliba in Arabic sources, were prized. They were taken to Baghdad, to Cordoba, to the harems and military garrisons of the entire Muslim world. This network ran for 300 years. It was systematic. It was industrialized. And it dwarfed the Western trade. The longships on the Dnieper and the Volga carried cargoes of human misery that defined the economies of three civilizations. But what about the slaves who weren't sold? What about the captives taken from Lindisfarne, or Jarrow, or the Slavic villages, who were transported back to Scandinavia itself? What was their fate? Part 1 described the grave goods, the decapitated bodies, but the reality was a legal and social system of total subjugation. This was thralldom. And in the Viking Age, the thrall was not a person. The thrall was property, chattel. The Icelandic law code, the Gragas, is explicit. A thrall had no legal rights. None. A master could kill his thrall, Stenurus, man or woman, for any reason, at any time. With no legal penalty, it was no different from killing a cow or a horse. If another freeman killed your thrall, the penalty wasn't murder, it was property damage. The killer owed the master, the war guild, the price of the thrall, not a fine for taking a life. A reimbursement for destroying an asset. The thrall's family, if they even still existed, received nothing. This status was hereditary. The child of a thrall woman was a thrall born into slavery. It did not matter who the father was. Even if the master himself fathered the child, that child was born a slave, the master's property. This was the source of multi-generational wealth. One captive woman, like the ones taken from Houth in 821, could produce an entire lineage of slaves, a self-replicating labor force. What did they do? Everything. Thralls built the ships. Thralls plowed the fields. Thralls built the great ring fortresses like Trelleborg, and the female thralls, the Embadir, they did the domestic work. They ground the grain, they cooked the food, and they produced the textiles. We mentioned the sailcloth. 90 square meters of wool, 5 years of labor for one person. A single longship needed one sail. A fleet of 100 ships, like the one that attacked Paris in 885, needed 100 sails. That is 500 person years of labor. You cannot build a fleet like that with free labor. You must force it. The Viking expansion was woven by enslaved women, and their vulnerability was absolute. A thrall woman had no right to refuse her master. Concubinage was not a choice. It was a function of her enslavement. But it was worse than that. She had no legal protection from any freeman. If a freeman, a guest, or the master's son raped a thrall, it was not a crime against her. It was, at most, a minor property offense against her master, and most masters would not pursue it. She had no recourse. No one to appeal to. Her body was not her own. We see this reflected in the sagas, written centuries later, but remembering the social structure. In the Laxdæla saga, the Irish noblewoman, Melkorka, is captured in a raid and sold as a concubine to an Icelandic chieftain. She refuses to speak. Pretending to be mute for years, a desperate, passive resistance, she is high status, a king's daughter. It does not matter. She is a thrall. Her son, Olafur, is born a slave. Only later, when her master overhears her speaking to her son in Gaelic, is her secret revealed. Olafur eventually gains status because his father is a freeman, but Melkorka's fate, her capture and subjugation, was the reality for thousands. This system, this absolute power, created a society built on a foundation of terror. The thralls were always a potential threat. They outnumbered the freemen in many settlements, and sometimes they rebelled. The Sturlunga saga mentions a feast where slaves planned to rise up and kill their masters. The plot was discovered. The ringleaders were captured. One was blinded. One was castrated. The others were systematically tortured and killed. The message had to be clear. Resistance was impossible. The physical evidence supports this social chasm. Excavations of burial sites across Scandinavia, from Birka in Sweden to the farms of Norway, show the same pattern. High-status freemen are buried with swords, with shields, with sacrificed horses. Thralls are buried in shallow graves, sometimes with a simple tool, often with nothing. Isotope analysis of their bones, the chemical signatures left by the food and water they consumed in childhood, proves they were not local. They came from Ireland, from Scotland, from the Slavic East. They were brought to Scandinavia in chains and worked to death. The sanctuary of the church was a lie. We established that, but the illusion of sanctuary was only the beginning of the horror. It was the gateway, the moment of capture, the desecration of the altar at Lindisfarne, the blood on the stones at Iona. That was the violent transition from person to property. The life that followed was a living death. Whether you were sold east to Baghdad, west to Dublin, or kept on a Norwegian fjord, you had ceased to be human in the eyes of the law. You were cargo, you were livestock, you were a tool. The great halls, the dragon ships, the epic sagas of heroes and kings, all of it was built on this. The Viking Age was funded by human trafficking. Its economy ran on forced labor. Its ships were rigged with sails woven by captive hands. The cold, quotable line is this: the price of a longship was paid in human souls.